hiding in an abandoned cabin to avoid claiming. The Omega opened the door to the Lycan king. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Moore had learned how to disappear without leaving tracks. She chose the abandoned cabin because no one ever looked twice at places that felt forgotten. And this one sat nearly 2 miles off the nearest gravel road, tucked behind tall pines and a bend in the creek that muffled sound. The air smelled of damp wood and winter leaves, and the temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to sharpen her focus. Inside, the cabin was simple, a single room with a small iron stove, a rough table, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. Elena moved quietly, careful with every step, mindful of the faint creak in the floorboards she had already memorized. She kept her scarf wrapped close, a practiced habit meant to dull her scent, and she counted her breaths until her pulse slowed. This was the last place she could think of where time felt paused, where the rules of claiming and ceremonies and expectations couldn't reach her, at least not tonight. She had left before dawn, before anyone could notice the absence, before the questions began, before a choice could be forced on her. The idea of claiming filled her with a tight, restless pressure she couldn't name, not fear exactly, but a deep resistance to being decided for, as if her life were a door others felt entitled to open. In the quiet of the cabin, she let herself remember why she ran, how she had watched other Omegas lose themselves to obligations they never asked for, how the word destiny was often used to excuse control. Elena believed that destiny should feel like recognition, not surrender, and until she understood the difference, she would remain unseen. She checked the small window, wiped the glass with her sleeve, and confirmed the forest beyond remained empty, only branches swaying and snow beginning to dust the ground in thin, clean lines. She lit the stove with practiced efficiency, the flame catching and warming the room inch by inch, and she set a kettle to heat, grateful for the steady sound. Hours passed, measured by the hiss of steam and the low crackle of wood, and with each minute the world outside seemed farther away. Then, as evening settled and the sky deepened into blue-gray, a sound cut through the quiet, soft but unmistakable, a knock at the door. Elena froze, her hand hovering midair, heart quickening as she listened again. Another knock followed, patient, controlled, not demanding. She swallowed, reminding herself that hiding was a choice, not a promise of safety, and she stepped closer, careful, silent, her breath shallow as she reached for the latch, unaware that the night had already decided to test the boundaries she had drawn. Elena did not open the door right away. She stood there with her palm pressed flat against the rough wood, feeling the faint vibration of the night through it, counting the seconds between her breaths. Whoever stood outside had not tried the handle, had not raised their voice, had not announced themselves, and that restraint unsettled her more than urgency would have. She had learned that most people, when denied, pushed harder. This presence waited. Her thoughts drifted backward, to the reasons she had chosen isolation over certainty, to the morning she left before the sky lightened, carrying only what she could manage in one pack. She remembered the way claiming day was spoken about back home, framed as a celebration, a moment of belonging, but she had seen the aftermath too often to believe the story without question. She had watched Omegas lose the quiet parts of themselves, watched decisions get made quickly, and called fate simply because it sounded kinder. Elena wanted a choice that felt like recognition, not a sentence handed down by tradition. The knock came again, steady and calm, and she realized that if she did nothing, the night would stretch on like this, suspended. She cracked the door just enough to see, keeping the chain in place, the cold air slipping in along her wrist. The man on the other side stood a few steps back, tall but unassuming in posture, his dark coat dusted with fresh snow, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. The porch light caught his face in partial shadow, but his eyes were clear, focused, and strangely quiet, as if he had already accepted any answer she might give. He said his name was Rowan, his voice low and even, and explained that the weather had turned faster than expected, that he was hoping for shelter until morning. He did not ask for anything else. Elena hesitated, every instinct urging caution, yet something about the way he held himself felt deliberate, not threatening, not desperate. She opened the door wider and gestured him inside, the warmth from the stove meeting the cold that followed him in. Rowan paused at the threshold, as if waiting for permission beyond the physical, then stepped in and closed the door carefully behind him. Up close, Elena noticed details she had missed, the way his breathing stayed steady despite the cold, the way his gaze took in the room without lingering on her, respectful and contained. He thanked her, removing his coat and setting it neatly on the chair, and the simple courtesy put her more at ease than any explanation could have. They shared the quiet for a moment, broken only by the kettle beginning to sing softly. Elena poured water into 2 chipped mugs, surprising herself with the gesture, and handed one to him. Their fingers did not touch. Rowan accepted it with a nod, warming his hands around the ceramic, and for a brief second, Elena felt the tension in her chest loosen. She reminded herself that shelter did not mean safety, that one night did not erase the reasons she was hiding. Yet as the wind picked up outside and snow brushed against the windows, the cabin felt less like a refuge built on fear and more like a pause she had not known she needed. She sat across from him at the small table, keeping distance, observing, listening to the quiet strength in his presence, unaware that this interruption was not random at all, but the first crack in the careful distance she had built between herself and everything she was running from. The wind intensified as the night settled fully around the cabin, snow tapping softly against the windows like quiet questions, and Elena found herself more aware of Rowan with every passing minute, not because of what he did, but because of what he did not do. He did not press for conversation, did not fill the silence with explanations or charm, and that restraint made the small space feel balanced rather than crowded. When he finally spoke, it was to comment on the weather, noting how the temperature had dropped faster than forecast, his tone practical and grounded, as if he measured the world by observation instead of assumption. Elena nodded, listening, surprised by how easily the quiet returned after each sentence, as though the cabin itself approved of moderation. She noticed how he chose the chair farthest from the bed, how he angled his body slightly away from her, a subtle signal of respect that eased the constant alertness she carried. Still, her instincts remained awake, tracking small details she could not fully explain, the way his awareness seemed to extend beyond the room, the way his gaze occasionally lifted toward the door before any sound reached her ears. At one point, a branch cracked outside under the weight of snow, and before she could react, Rowan had already turned his head, listening, then relaxing once the sound resolved itself into nothing more than the forest settling. He caught her look and offered a small, apologetic smile, explaining that he had spent a lot of time outdoors and habits lingered. Elena accepted the explanation, though it did not answer everything. She told herself that caution did not require suspicion, and that sharing space did not mean sharing secrets. As the hours stretched on, the warmth from the stove deepened, and the cabin filled with the steady comfort of heat and muted sound. Rowan excused himself briefly to step outside and check the perimeter for fallen branches, asking permission before opening the door, and Elena watched him move through the snow with an ease that did not match the tired traveler he claimed to be. When he returned, brushing snow from his boots, the air shifted subtly, as if something unseen had been set right. He mentioned that the storm would pass by morning, that the sky would clear, and his certainty carried a quiet authority that made her believe him without knowing why. They spoke then, cautiously, about neutral things, places they had passed through, roads that no longer appeared on maps, the comfort of small shelters in bad weather. Elena shared little, careful to keep her past folded inward, yet she felt an unexpected pull toward honesty when he listened, not probing, not judging, simply present. As midnight approached, fatigue softened the edges of her vigilance, and she realized that for the first time since she ran, her shoulders were not locked with tension. Rowan offered to take the floor near the door, insisting without argument that she take the bed, framing it as a practical choice rather than a gesture. She hesitated, then agreed, recognizing that insisting otherwise would only draw attention to the imbalance she was trying to avoid. As she lay back, staring at the low ceiling. She became acutely aware of his steady breathing on the other side of the room, grounding and controlled, a reminder that she was not alone but not threatened either. Sleep came slowly, drifting in and out, carrying fragments of sound and warmth. And somewhere in that space between waking and rest, Elena sensed that the night was not simply passing over her, but quietly rearranging the path she thought she had escaped. Morning arrived quietly, a pale light filtering through the frost-edged window panes, and Elena woke with the strange disorientation that came from sleeping deeply in an unfamiliar place. For a few seconds she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the night returned, the knock, the stranger, the shared silence. She pushed herself up on one elbow and scanned the room. Rowan was already awake, seated near the door with his coat folded beside him, gazing out the window as if tracking something beyond the trees. He noticed her movement immediately and turned, his expression calm, alert, and entirely unintrusive, offering a simple good morning that felt more like a check-in than a claim on her attention. The storm had passed, he said, the sky clearing faster than expected, and when Elena stood and looked for herself, she saw clean blue stretching above the forest, sunlight catching on the snow in sharp, honest brightness. The sight should have brought relief, yet a subtle unease settled in her chest, because daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant choices she had been delaying. She busied herself with the small rituals of morning, adding wood to the stove, pouring the last of the water into the kettle, grounding herself in motion. Rowan moved as well, careful not to crowd her, offering help only once, and accepting her quiet refusal without question. As they shared the remaining food, Elena noticed how little he seemed affected by the cold, how his hands were warm without hovering near the fire, how his senses appeared tuned beyond what the cabin alone could explain. At one point, she brushed past him to reach the shelf, and for the briefest moment, she felt a steady warmth that did not belong to the stove or the room, a presence that made her pause mid-step. Rowan stepped back immediately, giving her space, but his eyes held a flicker of awareness, as if he had felt it too. He apologized softly, though she was not sure for what, and the moment passed, leaving questions behind. Outside, the forest stood quiet and open, and Rowan mentioned that he would continue on soon, that the roads would be passable now. The words should have settled everything. Yet Elena found herself studying him with a new intensity, realizing that part of her had grown accustomed to his steady presence faster than she cared to admit. She asked where he was headed, keeping her tone neutral, and he answered honestly but vaguely, naming a direction rather than a destination, as though places mattered less than movement. When he stood to gather his coat, Elena felt an unexpected tightening in her chest, not fear, not relief, but a recognition that this encounter had already altered something she had believed fixed. Before opening the door, Rowan paused and looked at her, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet consideration that made her feel seen rather than assessed. He told her that the cabin was a good place to rest, but not a place to disappear forever, and the words landed gently, without judgment, echoing thoughts she had refused to voice even to herself. Elena said nothing, yet the truth of it settled in her bones. As he stepped outside, sunlight spilling in behind him, she realized that hiding had never truly been about safety, but about time, and that time was beginning to move again, whether she was ready or not. Elena watched Rowan walk a short distance from the cabin before stopping, as if reconsidering his route, and when he turned back, it was not with urgency, but with intention, the kind that suggested a choice rather than necessity. He explained that the snow had covered one of the narrower paths, and that he would wait a little longer before leaving, giving the sun time to do its work, and Elena nodded, surprised by the small relief that followed. The hours that came after unfolded slowly, filled with ordinary movements that felt unusually charged, the sound of water heating, the scrape of boots against the floor, the forest waking beyond the windows. As the sun climbed, warmth seeped into the cabin, and with it came a subtle shift in Elena, a growing awareness that her careful control was thinning. She noticed it first in her breathing, how it deepened without her permission, then in the faint change in the air when she crossed the room, something she had trained herself to ignore. She adjusted her scarf instinctively, stepping toward the open window for fresh air, But before she could reach it, Rowan spoke her name, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to stop her. His gaze held hers, steady and focused, and he asked if she was all right. The question seemed simple, yet it landed with unexpected weight, because it was the first time someone had asked without an agenda attached. Elena hesitated, then answered that she was fine, though the word felt incomplete even as she said it. Rowan nodded, accepting the response, but he shifted position slightly, placing himself between her and the door without making it obvious, as if anticipating something she could not yet sense. Moments later, distant voices carried faintly through the trees, not close enough to be clear, but close enough to set her nerves on edge. Elena stiffened, her instincts flaring, and she realized too late that the careful balance she had maintained all morning was slipping. Rowan reacted instantly, though quietly, moving to the window and scanning the tree line, his posture alert but controlled. He told her that they were not headed this way, that the forest carried sound strangely after snow, and his calm certainty eased her panic even as questions multiplied. She became acutely aware of the space between them, of the warmth that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface when he stood near, and for the first time, she wondered whether he was holding something back, not out of deception, but restraint. As the voices faded, Rowan turned to her and said softly that she did not need to hide her fear here, that whatever she was running from, it did not define her worth. The words struck deeper than she expected, because they mirrored thoughts she had never spoken aloud. Elena looked away, focusing on the pattern of frost melting on the glass, and admitted that being found felt more dangerous than being alone. Rowan considered this, then replied that being found by the wrong person was dangerous, but being seen by the right one could be a beginning rather than an ending. The statement was gentle, not persuasive, and that made it harder to dismiss. As the afternoon light shifted, Elena realized that the tension she felt was no longer solely about discovery, but about choice, about whether she would retreat again or step forward into something undefined. Rowan gathered his coat once more, testing the door as if ready to leave, and she sensed that this moment mattered more than the others, that whatever she said or did next would echo beyond the cabin walls. She did not stop him, but she did not turn away either, and in that narrow space between action and stillness, the quiet understanding between them deepened, fragile and real, waiting for the next breath to decide its shape. The moment stretched longer than Elena expected, filled with the soft sounds of the cabin settling and the distant drip of melting snow, and she realized that waiting had become a habit she no longer wanted to keep. Rowan stood near the door, not facing it fully, as if giving her time to decide whether his presence was temporary or something she would acknowledge. She surprised herself by speaking first, telling him he did not have to leave just because the weather had cleared, that the roads would still be rough for a while. Rowan studied her for a brief second, reading not just the words but the hesitation behind them, and then he set his coat back down without comment. The quiet that followed felt different, less fragile, more intentional, and Elena felt a subtle shift inside her, like choosing a direction after standing still too long. They spent the afternoon together in a careful rhythm, neither avoiding nor pressing, sharing tasks that did not require explanation. Rowan fixed a loose hinge on the door with steady hands, moving with a confidence that suggested he was accustomed to solving problems without drawing attention to himself, while Elena organized the small space, grateful for motion that calmed her thoughts. Every now and then, their awareness brushed against each other, a recognition that did not demand anything, only acknowledged presence. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the floor, and Elena felt the familiar tension return, sharper now because she was no longer alone with it. She stepped outside briefly, breathing in the cold air, reminding herself that hiding had been a choice born of fear, not a permanent state. Rowan joined her a few feet away, maintaining distance, and told her that whatever she was avoiding, it did not need to be decided tonight. The way he said it carried certainty without pressure, and she realized that he was offering something rare, the freedom to choose without being rushed. Back inside, the light softened, and Elena felt the edge of something she had tried to suppress all day, the quiet pull that came not from instinct alone, but from trust forming where she least expected it. She adjusted her scarf again, then let her hands fall, tired of pretending she was unaffected. Rowan noticed the change and turned away slightly, a deliberate act of restraint that spoke louder than words. He told her that he would not cross boundaries she had not opened herself, that he understood the cost of being claimed without consent. The admission struck her deeply, because it echoed her own fear with surprising accuracy. She asked how he knew, and he answered honestly that some truths were learned by watching, by listening, by choosing not to take what was offered too easily. As evening settled, they shared a simple meal, the quiet between them no longer tense but thoughtful, and Elena realized that the choice she faced was not about staying or leaving, but about whether she would allow herself to be seen without armor. Rowan rose afterward and said he would take a walk to check the perimeter again, not because there was danger, but because movement helped him think. Elena watched him step into the fading light, feeling the absence immediately, and she understood then that the cabin had stopped being a hiding place and had become a threshold. When Rowan returned, the air between them felt settled, as if something had been decided without words. Elena met his gaze, steady now, and said that she was tired of running without knowing what she was running toward. Rowan listened, his expression open, and replied that sometimes the first step was simply choosing not to close the door. The fire crackled softly as night reclaimed the forest, and Elena felt the weight of her choice settle, not heavy, but grounding, as she stood in the quiet with someone who had not claimed her, yet had chosen to stay. The night deepened with a clarity that felt deliberate, stars sharp against the cold sky, and Elena sensed the shift before she heard anything, a subtle tightening in the air that made the fire seem quieter than before. Rowan had been still for several minutes, listening, his attention angled outward, and when footsteps approached along the far edge of the clearing, he rose without haste, placing himself slightly forward, not blocking her path, but shielding her presence all the same. The voices that followed were measured and formal, carried on the wind rather than forced through the trees, and Elena recognized the tone even before the words reached her, the sound of authority wrapped in restraint. Rowan answered them calmly from the doorway, his voice unchanged, yet layered now with something deeper, a resonance that made the space feel larger than the cabin itself. Elena stepped closer despite herself, curiosity overcoming caution, and watched as two figures stopped at a respectful distance, heads inclined, posture unmistakably deferential. They addressed Rowan not by the name he had given her, but by a title spoken softly, with care, as if the night itself were listening. The meaning settled slowly, then all at once, and Elena felt the world realign around that single truth. The stranger she had sheltered was no traveler passing through, but the Lycan king spoken of in hushed conversations and careful legends. Rowan turned toward her, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty, and told her that he had not come seeking recognition, that he had chosen the quiet path because power revealed too easily often invited fear rather than trust. He explained that his people were near only to ensure his safety, not to claim territory or press demands, and with a single gesture, he sent them away, the figures retreating into the forest without argument. The clearing fell silent again, the authority he carried dissolving back into stillness as if it had never been there at all. Elena stood rooted, heart steady but mind racing, measuring the man she knew against the truth now laid bare, searching for signs of deception and finding none. Rowan did not step closer, did not reach for her, did not offer justification beyond what she deserved, and that restraint anchored her more than any promise could have. She asked him why he had not told her sooner, and he answered that titles had a way of deciding outcomes before people could, that he wanted to be seen as a choice rather than a force. The simplicity of the explanation disarmed her, because it aligned too closely with her own fears to be coincidence. Elena took a slow breath, the cold filling her lungs, and acknowledged the weight of what stood before her, without shrinking from it. She told him that she had run from claiming because it erased the space where consent lived, because destiny without choice felt like confinement dressed in ceremony. Rowan listened, nodding once, and said that any bond formed without her willing step would mean nothing to him, that a crown did not grant him the right to decide her future. The words rang true, not as reassurance, but as principle, and Elena felt the last of her defenses shift, not falling, but realigning. The cabin behind them felt smaller now, not because it had failed her, but because it had served its purpose, revealing rather than hiding the truth she needed. Rowan asked what she wanted, not what she feared, and for the first time since she fled, the answer did not feel distant. Elena looked at the open forest, at the man who had waited rather than taken, and understood that revelation did not have to arrive as a storm, that sometimes it came as quiet clarity, leaving her free to choose what came next. The clearing held its breath after the truth settled, and Elena felt the familiar urge to step back, not from Rowan himself, but from the weight of what his presence represented. She took a few measured steps toward the edge of the trees, needing space to steady herself, and Rowan did not follow. He remained where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open, allowing the distance without comment, a quiet acknowledgement that choice mattered more than proximity. Elena listened to the forest, to her own heartbeat finding a calmer rhythm, and reminded herself that fear did not have to dictate motion. When she turned back, Rowan was still watching her with the same patient attention, neither hopeful nor resigned, simply present. He spoke then, not to persuade, but to clarify, saying that he would leave if she asked, that his people would not return, and that no claim would be made unless she chose it freely and fully. The words were careful, precise, built to remove pressure rather than apply it, and Elena felt the last sharp edge of panic soften into something she could examine. She admitted that part of her wanted to run again, because running had kept her safe for so long, and Rowan nodded, acknowledging the truth without diminishing it. He replied that safety built only on distance eventually became another kind of cage, and that choosing did not mean surrendering independence, it meant defining it. Elena studied his face, searching for expectation and finding none, only a steady respect that did not waver when she hesitated. The fire inside the cabin cast a warm glow through the doorway, and she realized that the place she had chosen to hide had become a witness rather than a refuge, reflecting back the strength she had underestimated in herself. She stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, and told Rowan that if she stayed, it would be on her terms, without ceremony or pressure, without the language of ownership that had driven her away. Rowan agreed immediately, his voice firm but gentle, stating that bonds formed by force faded, while those formed by trust endured. He offered his hand, not extended toward her, but held loosely at his side, an invitation that could be withdrawn without consequence. Elena felt the significance of that restraint more strongly than any command, and she took a slow breath, grounding herself in the cold night air. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his, initiating the contact herself, surprised by the calm warmth that met her touch, steady and reassuring without pulling her closer than she wished to be. The connection that sparked was subtle, not overwhelming, a quiet recognition rather than a claim, and Elena realized that this was what she had been searching for, a bond that began with consent and grew at its own pace. Rowan did not tighten his grip, did not draw her in, allowing the moment to remain exactly what she made it. She met his gaze and said that she was not ready for promises, but she was ready to stop running, and Rowan answered that beginnings did not require vows, only honesty. The forest seemed to exhale around them, the tension easing as if the land itself approved of the balance struck. Elena released his hand and felt no loss, only the certainty that the choice remained hers, intact and respected. As they turned back toward the cabin together, not leading and not following, she understood that freedom did not disappear when shared, that sometimes it became clearer, stronger, when someone chose to walk beside her without trying to claim the path. The cabin felt different in the quiet that followed, not smaller or larger, but complete, as if it had finally revealed what it was meant to hold. Dawn approached slowly, the sky paling at the edges, and Elena stood near the window watching the forest soften as night loosened its grip. Rowan remained a few steps behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to respect the space she still claimed as her own. Neither spoke for a while, and the silence no longer carried uncertainty, only the steady comfort of something chosen rather than imposed. Elena realized that for the first time since she ran, her thoughts were not anchored to escape routes or imagined threats, but to the simple reality of where she was standing. She turned and met Rowan's gaze, seeing not a king or a legend, but a man who had waited when he could have commanded, who had listened when he could have decided. She told him that she would leave the cabin soon, not because she was being forced, but because hiding no longer served her, and Rowan nodded, accepting her decision without claiming credit for it. He said that paths were meant to be walked, not guarded forever, and that wherever she chose to go next, the choice would remain hers. As the first sunlight reached the clearing, Elena stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the ground solid beneath her boots. The forest looked the same, yet she understood that she was not. Rowan joined her at her side, not leading, not following, and together they watched the light spread through the trees. He told her that he would return to his people soon. That responsibilities waited, but that distance did not erase connection, and Elena accepted that truth without fear. She did not ask for promises or timelines, because she had learned that certainty built too quickly often collapsed just as fast. Instead, she acknowledged the quiet bond that had formed, one rooted in respect and patience, and trusted that it would grow as it was meant to. When Rowan finally turned to leave, he paused and looked back, not with expectation, but with an openness that left the door unbarred. Elena felt no pull to run after him, no need to retreat inside, only a calm readiness for what came next. She watched him disappear into the forest, knowing that their paths would cross again not because destiny demanded it, but because choice allowed it. Standing alone in the clearing, Elena felt the weight of the past loosen its hold, replaced by a steadier sense of self. The cabin behind her remained, no longer a hiding place, but a reminder of the moment she chose to stop disappearing. She adjusted her scarf, not to mask herself, but to face the morning chill, and stepped forward into the light, carrying with her the understanding that freedom was not found in isolation, but in the courage to choose who walked beside her. The forest welcomed her movement without resistance, and as she left the clearing behind, Elena knew that the life waiting ahead would be shaped not by fear or force, but by the quiet strength of consent, trust, and the promise of a bond that began when she finally opened the door.